Derbyshire, May 1814. The morning mist clung to the narrow country lane between Ashford Village and Bakewell Market, like a cold, unwelcome embrace, refusing to release its grip despite the sun's determined ascent. The hedgerows on either side dripped with dew, and the rutted track bore evidence of the previous night's rain in puddles deep enough to swallow a boot. Patience. Dorothy Wentworth ran through that mist with her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in sharp gasps that burned her throat. At 24, she was no stranger to early morning exertion. The hard life on her father's tenant farm had forged her strength and resilience. But this morning was different. This morning, her younger brother Timothy lay in their cottage bed, his lungs rattling with each shallow breath, and the apothecary's tonic was still 3 miles distant in Bakewell. She rounded a bend in the lane and stopped so abruptly that she nearly fell, her worn boots sliding in the mud. Blocking the entire width of the narrow track stood an elegant carriage, its polished black lacquer gleaming even in the grey morning light, its wheels sunk deep into a particularly vicious rut. Beside it stood a tall man in a coat so fine that it must have cost more than her father's annual rent. If stories of ordinary women who refuse to bow to arrogance move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. The man stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, studying the fields that stretched away to the east with an intensity that suggested he owned every blade of grass, which Patience realized with a sinking sensation he very likely did. No common traveller wore clothing of such quality in this remote corner of Derbyshire. "Excuse me," Patience called, her voice sharper than she intended. "I need to pass." The man turned slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, which perhaps he did. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the colour of storm clouds over the Peak District. His face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent considerable time in harsh climates, though his bearing spoke of wealth and privilege. "As you may observe, the carriage wheels are rather firmly lodged in this unfortunate rut," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of the aristocracy. "You may have the kindness to wait until the issue is resolved." Patience felt something hot and desperate rise in her chest. "I cannot wait. My brother needs medicine from Bakewell, and every moment I stand here is a moment he suffers." The man's expression did not change. He glanced at the carriage where 2 servants were attempting to free the wheels, then back at Patience. "These matters take time. Patience is a virtue, miss." The irony of his words, spoken to a woman christened Patience, might have made her laugh on any other day. Today, it made her furious. "A virtue of waiting offers little comfort to a suffering boy," she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "My brother cannot breathe properly. My father waits at the mill to discuss grain prices that will determine whether we eat this winter. My intended expects my help with the sheep shearing, and you stand in the middle of the lane as if you own it." "I do own it," the man said simply. "I own this lane, those fields, and very likely the cottage where your brother lies ill." The casual certainty in his voice was the final spark to tinder already burning. Patience looked down at the puddle beside her foot, deep and thick with mud from the previous night's rain. She bent, scooped up a handful of the cold, dark muck, and hurled it at the tall stranger with all the force of her desperation and rage. The mud struck him squarely in the chest, splattering across his expensive coat and up onto his perfectly tied cravat. Drops speckled his face. His pristine boots, polished to a mirror shine, were suddenly brown with mire. For a long moment, he stood absolutely still, shock rendering him silent as the mud dripped slowly down his coat. Patience did not wait to see his reaction. She gathered her skirts, plunged into the ditch beside the lane, scrambled up the opposite bank through thorns and nettles, and continued her run across the field toward Bakewell. Her own skirt was now as muddy as his coat, her hands scratched and bleeding from the brambles, but Timothy needed that tonic. Nothing else mattered. Behind her, she heard a sound that was either a stifled laugh or a roar of outrage. She did not look back. The apothecary's shop in Bakewell smelled of dried herbs and camphor. Mr. Wickham, a kindly man of 60, with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose, prepared the tonic, while Patience caught her breath, and tried to calm her racing heart. "Young Timothy having trouble with his lungs again?" Mr. Wickham asked, measuring out a dark liquid into a brown glass bottle. "The spring damp is hard on weak chests. This should ease his breathing, but mind you keep him warm and out of the morning air." "Thank you," Patience said, counting out the precious coins from her small leather purse. Each one represented hours of work: butter churned, eggs collected, vegetables sold at market. "How much do I owe you?" "4 shillings, my dear, and tell your father that Robert Wentworth's word is as good as gold in this town. We all remember how he helped during the floods of 1812. Patience paid, tucked the bottle carefully into her pocket, and began the long walk home. The sun had burned away most of the mist now, revealing the Derbyshire countryside in all its spring glory. Green fields stretched in every direction, divided by ancient stone walls and dotted with sheep. In the distance she could see the grey stone tower of St. Mary's Church in Ashford, and beyond it, on the hill, the imposing mass of Rutland Hall. She tried not to think about the man she had assaulted with mud, tried not to imagine the consequences if he truly was someone important, someone with the power to make her family's life difficult. But worry gnawed at her with sharp teeth as she walked. By the time Patience reached the small cottage her family had called home for 22 years, her father Robert was already there, his weathered face creased with concern. At 53, Robert Wentworth bore the marks of a lifetime spent working the land. His hands were permanently stained with soil, his back slightly bent from years of labor, but his eyes were kind, and his word in the village was iron. "Where have you been?" he asked as Patience rushed through the door. "Timothy's been asking for you." "Bakewell, for the tonic," Patience said, already climbing the narrow stairs to the room she shared with her brother. Timothy lay in his bed, his 16-year-old face pale against the pillow, his breathing shallow and labored. When he saw her, he attempted a smile. "Did you fly there and back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something like that," Patience said, pouring a spoonful of the dark tonic. "Mr. Wickham says this will help. Open." Timothy swallowed the medicine with a grimace, then settled back against his pillows. Within minutes his breathing had eased slightly, and color began to return to his cheeks. Patience sat beside him, holding his hand, and felt the fear that had driven her through the morning begin to loosen its grip. "There was a grand carriage blocking the lane," Timothy said after a while, his voice stronger now. "I heard it from the window. Did you see it?" Patience hesitated. "I saw it." "And?" "And I may have done something rather foolish." Timothy's eyes brightened with interest despite his illness. "Tell me." So Patience told him about the tall stranger, about his arrogant certainty that she should wait, about the mud she had thrown. Timothy's laugh turned into a cough, but his eyes danced with delight. "You threw mud at a nobleman," he managed between coughs. "Patience, you are either very brave or recklessly imprudent." "The latter, I fear," Patience admitted. "But he made me so angry, Timothy. Standing there as if the whole world existed for his convenience, while you needed medicine." "What did he look like?" Timothy asked. Patience described the dark-haired stranger, his expensive clothes, his storm-grey eyes, the way he had looked at the fields as if cataloguing every acre. Timothy's expression grew thoughtful. "Sounds like it might have been the new Earl," he said quietly. "The Earl of Rutland. They say he returned from India about 18 months ago, after his father died. No one in the village has seen much of him, but the servants at Rutland Hall say he spends most of his time riding about the estate, looking at everything." Patience felt her stomach drop. "The Earl? I threw mud at the Earl of Rutland?" "If it was him, then yes," Timothy said, and despite his illness he was clearly trying not to laugh. "The man who owns our cottage, our fields, and every lane between here and Bakewell. That Earl." Patience stood and walked to the window, her hands trembling. Through the wavy glass, she could see the fields her father had cultivated for more than 2 decades, the neat rows of spring wheat, the kitchen garden where her mother had grown vegetables before her death 5 years ago. All of it held under a lease that could be terminated at the landlord's pleasure. "I have ruined us," she said quietly. "Father will lose the lease because I could not control my temper. Or perhaps," Timothy said, his voice growing drowsy as the tonic took effect. "The Earl will have learned that not everyone in Derbyshire bows and scrapes at his approach. Either way, it will make an interesting story." Patience did not find it interesting. She found it terrifying. That evening, as she helped her father with the evening milking, Patience confessed what she had done. Robert Wentworth listened in silence, his hands continuing their practiced rhythm on the cow's udders, milk hissing into the wooden pail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "You did what you thought necessary to help your brother. I cannot fault you for that, but I will not lie to you, daughter. Our position here is more precarious than you know." "What do you mean?" Patience asked, though dread already coiled in her stomach. Robert stood, carrying the full pail to the dairy, and Patience followed. In the cool dimness of the stone building, surrounded by the smell of milk and cheese, her father told her something he had kept hidden for 2 years. "When the floods came in 1812, he began, "we lost nearly everything. The harvest was destroyed, the south field was under water for weeks, and I had no way to pay the rent that quarter. I went to the old Earl, the current Earl's father, and begged for mercy. He granted it, but at a price." "What price?" Patience whispered. "A clause added to our lease," Robert said heavily. "It states that the estate may reclaim this land at any time, with 30 days' notice, and no compensation for any improvements I've made. The new barn, the stone walls I rebuilt, the drainage ditches I dug, all of it would revert to the estate without payment. We would leave with only what we could carry." Patience felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. "Why did you not tell me?" "What good would it have done?" her father asked gently. "You would have worried, and worry changes nothing. I hoped that if I kept my head down, paid the rent on time, caused no trouble, perhaps the clause would simply be forgotten. But if you have angered the new Earl, if he chooses to exercise that clause—" He did not finish the sentence, nor did he need to. Patience understood perfectly. They would lose everything. Her father's life's work, gone. Timothy would have to leave the countryside air that kept his lungs functioning. They would join the ranks of the landless poor, begging for work, perhaps forced into the factories of Manchester or Birmingham, where Timothy's weak lungs would kill him within a year. "I will apologize," Patience said firmly. "I will go to Rutland Hall tomorrow and beg his forgiveness. I will do whatever necessary to protect our home." "You will do no such thing," a new voice said from the doorway. Owen Fletcher stood there, his broad shoulders blocking the evening light, his honest face creased with concern. At 27, Owen was the youngest son of a prosperous farmer who owned his land outright, no landlord to answer to, no precarious lease. He had been courting Patience for 6 months with her father's blessing and her own mild acceptance. "Owen," Patience said, surprised, "I did not expect you this evening. I heard in the village about the incident with the Earl's carriage," Owen said, stepping into the dairy. He nodded respectfully to Robert. "Mr. Wentworth, I have come to speak with you about a matter of some urgency." Robert looked between the young people, his expression unreadable. "I will leave you to talk," he said quietly, and left them alone. Owen moved closer to Patience, his blue eyes serious. "I know about the clause in your father's lease," he said without preamble. "And my father told me years ago. He said it was a shameful thing to hold such power over a good man like Robert Wentworth." "Then you understand why I'm so worried," Patience said, "if the Earl chooses to evict us because of what I did." "Marry me," Owen interrupted. "Marry me now, before Michaelmas. If we wed before the 29th of September, when most leases come due, we can combine our households. 2 families together are stronger, harder for even an Earl to push aside. My father has already agreed to petition the Earl for a combined lease on both properties." Patience stared at him. "You want to marry me to save my father's farm?" "I want to marry you because you are a good woman, Patience Wentworth," Owen said earnestly. "Strong, capable, kind to your brother, devoted to your father. I have wanted to marry you since the first time I saw you at the Michaelmas Fair 3 years ago. This simply makes the timing more urgent. Say yes. Let me protect you and your family." It was a good offer. Owen Fletcher was a good man. He would be a steady husband, a reliable provider, a kind stepfather to any children they might have. He would never excite her heart, but he would never break it either. Safety, security, protection for her father and brother, all offered freely by a man who clearly cared for her. "Yes," Patience heard herself say. "Yes, Owen. I will marry you." The relief on his face was immediate and genuine. He took her hands in his grip warm and solid. "We will announce it at church on Sunday. The banns will be read for 3 weeks, and we can marry on the 28th of September, just before Michaelmas. Your family will be safe, Patience. I promise you that." After Owen left, Patience stood alone in the dairy as the last light faded from the sky. A profound sense of dread settled upon her. She had just agreed to marry a man she did not love, to save her family from a threat she herself had created. It felt like stepping into a cage, even as she understood it was a cage of her own making. Timothy was asleep when she checked on him later, his breathing steady now, the tonic having done its work. Patience sat on the edge of her own bed and looked at her hands, still bearing scratches from the morning's thorns. Those same hands had thrown mud at an Earl. Those same hands had just agreed to a marriage of convenience. She thought of the tall stranger's face, the shock in his storm-grey eyes as the mud hit him, the way he had stood so still. Had that been anger, or something else? And why, even now, did she feel a strange pull when she remembered the intensity of his gaze? It did not matter. By September's end, she would be Owen Fletcher's wife. The Earl of Rutland and his muddy coat would fade into memory, a cautionary tale about controlling one's temper. If only she could convince her racing heart to believe it. The following Sunday, all of Ashford turned out for the morning service at St. Mary's Church. The ancient stone building had stood for 400 years, weathering plague and civil war, its stained glass windows casting coloured light across the worn pews. Patience sat with her father and Timothy, who had insisted on attending despite his lingering weakness, and tried to focus on Vicar Daniels's sermon rather than the whispers that surrounded them. Word had spread about the mud incident. The village being small with fewer than 300 souls, gossip travelled faster than the post. Some thought it hilarious, a landowner getting his comeuppance from a farmer's daughter. Others thought it dangerous, courting the wrath of a man who held their livelihoods in his hands. "We will now announce the banns," Vicar Daniels said, his voice carrying through the church. "If any of you know cause or just impediment, why these persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, you are to declare it." Patience held her breath as the vicar announced her engagement to Owen Fletcher. She could feel the eyes of the congregation on her, could sense the surprise mixed with approval. Owen's family was well respected. It was considered a good match. It was then that the church door opened. Every head turned. Patience's heart stopped. The man who entered was not the mud-spattered stranger she remembered. He wore a perfectly tailored coat of deep blue, breeches that showed not a speck of dirt, and boots polished to perfection. His dark hair was carefully arranged, his cravat tied with mathematical precision. But his eyes were the same storm grey, and they swept across the congregation with unmistakable authority before landing on Patience. He walked down the centre aisle as the congregation watched in stunned silence. Even Vicar Daniels seemed uncertain whether to continue or wait. The man reached the front pew, the one that had stood empty for 18 months, the one reserved for the lord of the manor. He sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and nodded politely to the vicar. "Please continue," he said. His voice carried through the silent church. "I apologize for the interruption." Vicar Daniels, flustered, stumbled through the rest of the announcements. Patience barely heard them. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. This was him, the Earl of Rutland, the man she had covered in mud. And he had chosen this moment, this precise moment, to make his first public appearance in Ashford. The service concluded with agonizing slowness. When Vicar Daniels finally pronounced the blessing, the congregation filed out with unusual haste, everyone wanting to see what would happen next. Owen stayed close to Patience's side, his presence protective but also, she thought, slightly possessive. The Earl emerged from the church and stood in the small courtyard, the morning sun bright on his dark hair. People gathered at a respectful distance, whispering behind their hands. Robert Wentworth stood very still, his face pale. The Earl's gaze found Patience immediately. He walked toward her with deliberate steps, and the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. Owen moved slightly in front of Patience, a gesture of protection that the Earl noted with a slight raise of his eyebrow. "Miss Wentworth," the Earl said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet courtyard. "I believe we met a few days ago under rather unusual circumstances." Patience forced herself to meet his eyes. "My lord, I must apologize for my behavior. It was inexcusable. I let desperation overcome good sense and proper respect. I beg your forgiveness, and hope my actions will not reflect poorly on my family." She had rehearsed those words 100 times in her mind. They came out stiffly, formally, but clear. The Earl studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, his mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "Your brother required medicine urgently, I understand. Did the apothecary's tonic help?" The question caught Patience off guard. "Yes, my lord." His breathing improved considerably. "I am glad to hear it," the Earl said. He turned to Timothy, who stood beside their father, his eyes wide. "You are the young man with weak lungs?" "Yes, my lord," Timothy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I spent 12 years in India," the Earl said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "I saw many cases of respiratory weakness there. The dry season was better for such conditions, but during the monsoons, several methods proved effective. If you would permit it, I could send my personal physician to examine you. Dr. Marcus Bellamy studied in Edinburgh and has considerable experience with pulmonary ailments." The offer hung in the air, unexpected and generous. Patience looked at her father, who seemed as confused as she felt. "My lord, that is most kind, but we could not possibly accept such charity," Robert said carefully. "It is not charity," the Earl replied. "It is practical estate management. Healthy tenants are productive tenants. Besides, I find I am curious about the young man, whose need for medicine inspired such passionate defense from his sister." He glanced at Patience, and she could have sworn she saw amusement in those grey eyes. "Not many people stand up to me, Miss Wentworth. In 12 years abroad, I grew accustomed to obsequious agreement with everything I said. You reminded me that roads belong to everyone, not just those with expensive carriages. It was a lesson I needed." With that, he nodded to the assembled crowd and walked to his own carriage, which waited on the road. As he climbed in, he called back, "Dr. Bellamy will call this afternoon, Mr. Wentworth, if that is acceptable." Then he was gone, leaving the entire village buzzing with speculation and wonder. Patience stood motionless, trying to understand what had just happened. The Earl had not threatened them. He had not demanded recompense for his ruined coat. He had offered help. "That was very strange," Owen said beside her, his voice uncertain. "Why would the Earl take such interest in a tenant farmer's family?" Patience did not answer. She was remembering the way the Earl had looked at her in the churchyard, the way his eyes had seemed to see past her careful apology to something deeper. And she was remembering with uncomfortable clarity the sensation she had felt when she first saw him on that muddy lane, before anger had overwhelmed everything else. Recognition, as if some part of her had known, even then, that this man would matter. True to his word, Dr. Bellamy arrived that afternoon in a smart gig, his medical bag beside him. He was a man of perhaps 50, with silver hair and a shrewd, kind face. He examined Timothy thoroughly, asking detailed questions about the history of his illness, the frequency of attacks, what made them better or worse. "The Earl mentioned you have experience with lung complaints," Robert said, as the doctor packed his instruments away. "His lordship is too modest," Dr. Bellamy replied. "He does not just have experience. During his time in India, he funded a small hospital for plantation workers. Many suffered from various respiratory ailments due to the climate and working conditions. He was quite involved in their treatment, learning everything he could about pulmonary medicine. An unusual interest for a gentleman. But then, Miles Ashcroft has never been an ordinary nobleman." "Miles Ashcroft," Patience repeated softly. It was the first time she had heard his given name. "Yes," Dr. Bellamy said, "though you must call him Lord Rutland, of course. He is quite particular about proper forms of address in public, even if he is more relaxed in private company. The doctor prescribed a regime of specific herbs to be taken as tea twice daily, exercises to strengthen Timothy's breathing, and advised that the young man spend as much time as possible in open air during the warm months. "The country air here is good for him," Dr. Bellamy said. "Far better than the cities. He should improve considerably if he follows these recommendations." After the doctor left, Patience helped Timothy with his exercises, while her father prepared the evening meal. "Why do you suppose he undertook such an action?" Timothy asked between breaths. "The Earl, I mean. Why send his own physician?" "Perhaps he truly believes healthy tenants are better for the estate," Patience suggested, though she did not entirely believe it herself. "Or perhaps," Timothy said, his eyes twinkling despite his exertion, "he is interested in a certain farmer's daughter who is not afraid to throw mud at nobility." "Do not be ridiculous," Patience said firmly. "I am engaged to Owen Fletcher. The Earl is simply being a responsible landlord." But Timothy's knowing look followed her as she went about her evening chores, and she could not quite shake the feeling that her brother saw something she was trying very hard not to acknowledge. The summer that followed was unlike any Patience had experienced. Owen Fletcher was attentive, visiting 3 times a week, bringing small gifts and helping with the heavier farm work. The wedding preparations moved forward steadily. Patience's modest trousseau grew slowly, each piece sewn in the evenings by lamplight. The date was set, the 28th of September, and everyone in Ashford looked forward to the celebration. But running parallel to these ordinary preparations was something extraordinary. The Earl of Rutland appeared regularly on the roads around Ashford, always on horseback, always alone except for one groom who followed at a respectful distance. He would stop to speak with tenants, asking questions about crops, soil drainage, livestock health. He visited the mill, examined the bridge that needed repairs, discussed improved roads with the village council. It was unprecedented. The old Earl had visited Ashford perhaps twice a year, and then only to collect rents and issue pronouncements. His son seemed determined to know every inch of his inheritance, to understand not just the land, but the people who worked it. And he kept appearing wherever Patience happened to be. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone could call deliberate, but Patience would be at the village market selling eggs, and he would ride past, dismount to examine some vendors' wares, and somehow end up in conversation with her father about grain prices. She would be in the fields helping with the haying, and he would appear on the ridge above watching the work with that same intense focus. He had brought to the muddy lane, and then ride down to discuss harvesting techniques with the men. Once she was walking along the river path that bordered the Wentworth fields when his horse nearly ran her down. She leaped aside, her basket of wild herbs flying, and found herself looking up at Miles Ashcroft, Earl of Rutland, whose face registered something that looked very much like chagrin. "Miss Wentworth," he said, dismounting quickly. "I apologize. I was not paying sufficient attention to the path." "No harm done, my lord," Patience said, bending to gather her scattered herbs. He dismounted and helped her, his long fingers surprisingly gentle as he retrieved sprigs of feverfew and chamomile. "You gather medicinal plants?" he asked, placing them carefully back in her basket. "For my brother, my lord. Dr. Bellamy suggested certain herbs as tea. I prefer to gather them fresh when possible." "A wise practice," the Earl said. He stood, and she was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, how much taller he was than she had realized. "How does your brother fare?" "Much better, my lord. Your physician's recommendations have made a considerable difference. Timothy can now work for several hours without difficulty, and his night breathlessness has nearly disappeared." "I am very glad to hear it," the Earl said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I understand congratulations are in order. You are to marry Mr. Fletcher in September." "Yes, my lord. The 28th. A good man, I am told," the Earl said neutrally. "Steady, reliable with his own land." "Yes, my lord." "And you love him?" The question was so unexpected, so improper, that Patience felt her face flame. "My lord, that is hardly an appropriate question." "You are correct," he said immediately. "I apologize. I overstep. It is a fault of mine, I am told. 12 years in India, where social conventions were rather different, have left me somewhat deficient in English propriety." He remounted his horse with easy grace, but before riding away he looked down at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I hope you will be very happy, Miss Wentworth. You deserve happiness." Then he was gone, cantering down the path, leaving Patience standing with her basket of herbs and a heart that beat far too fast for comfort. That evening, Owen came to the cottage with his father, Harold Fletcher, a prosperous man of 60 with a shrewd eye for land and livestock. They came to discuss the wedding settlement, and Patience realized with growing unease to talk about something else entirely. "There is to be a great meeting," Harold Fletcher announced, settling himself in the cottage's best chair. "The Earl has summoned all his tenants to the village green next Sunday after church. Some grand announcement, they say." Robert Wentworth's face went carefully blank. "Do you know what manner of announcement?" "No one knows for certain," Harold said, leaning forward. "Mr. Hartwell, the steward, has confirmed with some certainty that changes are coming. The Earl has been studying the estate accounts, examining every lease, measuring every field. Mr. Hartwell mentioned something about consolidation, about making the estate more profitable." Patience felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Consolidation. That meant combining smaller holdings into larger farms, evicting tenants whose leases contained the kind of clause her father's did, turning tenant farmers into wage laborers, or forcing them off the land entirely. "Your lease is particularly vulnerable," Harold said to Robert, not unkindly. "That clause the old Earl added gives the current Earl complete freedom to reclaim your land without compensation. If he chooses to exercise it, you would have 30 days to vacate." "Which is why," Owen interjected, his voice firm, "we must accelerate the wedding plans. If Patience and I marry before the announcement, before any eviction notices are issued, the Earl will have to contend with 2 families, not 1. He may evict a single tenant farmer, but evicting a combined household that includes the son of Harold Fletcher, who has considerable influence in 3 counties, will be far more complicated." Patience looked at her father's face and saw the weight of worry he had carried for since 2 years, saw the pride that warred with pragmatism, the desire to provide for his children against the reality of their precarious position. "What do you advise, Harold?" Robert asked quietly. "Move the wedding forward," Harold said immediately. "We can get a special license, avoid the bans, marry them in 2 weeks instead of September. That gives us 6 weeks before Michaelmas. 6 weeks to establish the combined household and petition the Earl for a new lease that protects both families." "No," Patience said. All 3 men turned to look at her. "No?" Owen repeated, confusion clear in his voice. "We will wait for the announcement," Patience said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. "If the Earl intends to evict us, he will do so regardless of when I marry. But I will not build my marriage on a foundation of fear. Owen deserves better than a wife who wed him purely as a defensive maneuver, and I deserve the chance to marry with a clear head, knowing exactly what I am choosing." "Patience," her father began, but she shook her head. "Father, if the Earl means to destroy us, he will find a way. But something tells me that a man who sends his personal physician to care for Timothy's lungs, who stops to discuss grain prices and road repairs, is not a man bent on wholesale eviction. Let us at least hear what he has to say before we make decisions based on fear." Owen looked hurt. "You think I am using fear to manipulate you into marriage?" "I think," Patience said gently, "that everyone in this room is afraid, myself included. But fear makes poor choices. Let us wait until Sunday. Then we will know what we truly face." The men argued, but Patience held firm. Finally, reluctantly, they agreed to wait for the Earl's announcement before making any final decisions about the wedding date. After they left, Robert sat heavily at the kitchen table. "You are more like your mother every day," he said quietly. "She too could be stubborn as an ox when she believed she was right. I pray you are correct about the Earl, Patience. I truly do." Patience prayed the same thing. But as she climbed the stairs to her room that night, she could not help but wonder if her insistence on waiting had nothing to do with reason, and everything to do with the way her heart had raced when Miles Ashcroft had asked if she loved Owen Fletcher. Sunday arrived with clouds threatening rain. The entire village gathered on the green after church, more than 200 people crowding the space usually reserved for fairs and celebrations. Patience stood with her father and Timothy, Owen beside her, his presence solid but somehow oppressive. She could feel the tension in the crowd, the fear that ran beneath the polite conversations. The Earl arrived on horseback, alone except for his steward, Mr. Hartwell, who followed in a modest cart carrying a large leather case. Miles Ashcroft dismounted, and Patience was struck again by his presence, the way he seemed to command attention without effort. He wore no grand clothing today, just a simple coat and breeches suitable for the country. But his bearing left no doubt about his status. Mr. Hartwell set up a small table and began removing documents from the case. The crowd grew quiet, waiting. Children who had been playing stopped to watch. Even the dogs seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The Earl stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the green. I thank you all for gathering today. I know there has been considerable speculation about my intentions for this estate. I have spent the past 18 months learning about these lands, talking with many of you, examining the accounts and leases that govern our relationship. Today, I wish to announce certain changes. Patience felt her father tense beside her. Around them, people held their breath. My father, the Earl continued, was not a cruel man, but he was a fearful one. During times of hardship, he added clauses to leases that gave him the power to evict tenants at will, with no compensation for improvements made to the land. These clauses were designed to protect him from risk, but they did so by placing all risk onto the shoulders of those who work these fields. He paused, his grey eyes scanning the crowd. I have reviewed every lease on this estate. 47. Of you hold leases with such eviction clauses. 47. Families who have worked this land, some for generations, live under the constant threat of losing everything through no fault of their own. Murmurs ran through the crowd. People exchanged glances, some hopeful, others resigned to bad news. I am here today, the Earl said, his voice growing stronger, to announce that I am removing every single one of those clauses. Silence. Complete, stunned silence. Then, as the meaning of his words sank in, a sound like a wave breaking over shore, gasps and exclamations, and from several older men, choked sobs of relief. The Earl held up one hand for quiet. Mr. Hartwell has prepared new leases for every affected tenant. These leases guarantee tenure as long as rents are paid on time and the land is worked responsibly. They include fair compensation for any improvements you make. They cannot be terminated without cause and proper legal process. They are, in short, the kind of leases my tenants should have had all along. Robert Wentworth's face crumpled. Beside him, Timothy let out a whoop of joy that was quickly echoed by others in the crowd. People began talking all at once, laughing, crying, embracing. 22. Years of fear lifted in a single announcement. But the Earl was not finished. He waited for the noise to subside, then said, I must make one thing clear. I did not do this out of sentiment. I did it because it is just and because I believe that tenants who feel secure in their holdings will invest more in the land, will work harder, will ultimately make this estate more prosperous for everyone. Fear is a poor foundation for any relationship, whether between landlord and tenant or... He paused and his eyes found Patience in the crowd. For just a moment they held her gaze, and she felt something electric pass between them. Then he continued, his attention back on the crowd, or any other relationship. Security, trust, fair dealing, these are the only foundations worth building upon. The celebration that followed was spontaneous and joyous. Mr. Hartwell began distributing the new leases, families clustering around to sign, some making their mark with tears streaming down weathered faces. Robert Wentworth received his, read it carefully despite his blurred vision, then shook Mr. Hartwell's hand with fervent gratitude. Through it all, Patience watched the Earl. He moved through the crowd, accepting thanks with quiet grace, answering questions, discussing the specifics of the new lease terms. He seemed, she thought, genuinely pleased by the reaction, but also slightly uncomfortable with the effusive gratitude. As if he could not quite understand why people were so astonished that he had chosen to act with basic decency. She noticed something else too. Noticed the way his gaze kept returning to her, even as he spoke with others. Noticed how he seemed always aware of exactly where she stood in the crowd, and noticed with a sinking sensation in her stomach how Owen Fletcher noticed the same thing. The Earl is very interested in you, Owen said quietly beside her, his voice tight. "Everyone can see it." "Do not be absurd," Patience said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I am not absurd," Owen replied. "I am observant. He looks at you the way I wish you would look at me." Before Patience could respond, the crowd parted slightly and the Earl stood before them. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, nodding politely to Owen. "Miss Wentworth, Mr. Wentworth." He included Robert and Timothy in his acknowledgement. "I trust the new lease terms are satisfactory?" "More than satisfactory, my lord," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given my family security we have not known into 2 years. We are profoundly grateful. I hope," the Earl said carefully, "that this security will allow you to make decisions about your future based on what you truly want, rather than what fear dictates." The words were addressed to Robert, but his eyes were on Patience. She felt Owen stiffen beside her, felt her own heart begin to race. "Indeed, my lord," Robert said, clearly not understanding the undercurrent in the conversation. "My daughter is to marry Mr. Fletcher in September. The timing is now far more pleasant, knowing we celebrate from security rather than desperation." "I wish you both very happy," the Earl said, though something in his voice suggested the words cost him effort. He nodded again and moved away into the crowd, leaving Patience feeling as if something important had just happened, though she could not quite define what. That evening, as Patience helped her father celebrate their good fortune with a modest meal of roasted chicken and early potatoes from the garden, Timothy pulled her aside. "You cannot marry Owen," he said bluntly. "Timothy, I am not a child, Patience. I am 16 and I have eyes. You do not love Owen Fletcher. You never have. You agreed to marry him because you thought it was the only way to save this family, but the Earl has saved us. You are free to choose based on what you truly want." "And what do I want?" Patience asked, though she feared she knew the answer. "The man who sent his physician to cure me," Timothy said simply. "The man who removed eviction clauses from 47 leases because it was just, even though it gave him no financial benefit. The man who looks at you as if you are the only person in the world worth seeing." "The Earl of Rutland is far above my station," Patience said firmly. "Even if I felt something for him, which I do not admit, such a match would be impossible. He will marry someone appropriate to his rank. I am a tenant farmer's daughter. That is reality, Timothy." "Reality," Timothy said, "is that 3 months ago I could barely breathe and we faced eviction. Reality changes, Patience. Perhaps it is time you changed with it." The wedding was still set for the 28th of September, now just 4 weeks away. The church was reserved, the modest wedding breakfast planned, Owen's family eagerly preparing their home to receive a new bride. Everything moved forward with unstoppable momentum. The focus of Patience's anxiety changed. She found herself thinking constantly of grey eyes and intense gazes, of a man who had studied pulmonary medicine in India to help plantation workers, of how his face had looked when he announced the removal of eviction clauses. She compared those memories to the reality of Owen Fletcher, kind and solid and entirely predictable, and felt like the worst kind of traitor. Owen deserved better than a wife who could not give him her whole heart. But breaking an engagement a month before the wedding would create a scandal that would taint both families. Her father would be humiliated. Owen would be pitied. And for what? For the impossible fantasy that an earl might see past her 200 years of class distinction to care for a woman who had once thrown mud at him. It was madness. She would marry Owen as planned, make a good life with him, forget the way her pulse raced when Miles Ashcroft looked at her. It was the sensible choice, the only choice. She almost convinced herself it was true. 3. Weeks before the wedding, Patience was returning from the village with supplies when her father's old cart lost a wheel on the irrepaired lane that led to Ashford. She was struggling to examine the damage, knowing she would have to walk back to Ashford for help when hoofbeats announced a rider approaching. Miles Ashcroft reined in his horse, dismounted with easy grace, and immediately bent to examine the broken wheel. "The axle pin has sheared," he said without preamble. "The wheel cannot be reattached without proper tools. You will need to leave the cart here and return with help." "Yes, my lord," Patience said stiffly. "I had reached the same conclusion." He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "I will ride to Ashford and send someone back with tools and a fresh pin, but that will take perhaps an hour. May I offer you a ride home in the meantime? Your parcels can be left with the cart, locked safely. Propriety said she should refuse. A woman alone with a man, even riding double on a horse for the short distance home, courted gossip. But the alternative was standing alone on a deserted lane for an hour, and she was suddenly, desperately tired of always doing what propriety demanded. Yes, my lord, thank you. He mounted first, then extended his hand to help her up behind him. The moment she settled onto the horse, her arms tentatively circling his waist for balance, Patience knew she had made a terrible mistake. Even through the fabric of his coat, she could feel the solid strength of him, could smell the scent of leather and something indefinably masculine. Her heart hammered so loudly, she was certain he must feel it against his back. They rode in silence for several minutes. Then, without turning his head, the Earl said, "I must confess something, Miss Wentworth." "My lord?" "The broken wheel was not the first time I saw you on this lane. I have ridden past your father's fields at least a dozen times in the past month, hoping for a chance to see you, to speak with you. When I saw the cart today, I was absurdly grateful for the misfortune that required my assistance." Patience's breath caught. "My lord, you should not say such things. I am engaged to another man." "I know," he said, and there was real pain in his voice. "And I have no right to speak, but I find I cannot remain silent any longer. That first day on the muddy lane, you refused to bow to my arrogance. You put my convenience, my authority, my entire existence in proper perspective compared to your brother's genuine need. I had spent 12 years in India, surrounded by people who treated me as if I were some kind of minor deity, never contradicting, always agreeing, and then you threw mud at me." Despite everything, Patience felt laughter bubble up. "You found that admirable?" "I found it revelatory," he said simply. "In that moment, you treated me not as an earl but as an obstacle to be overcome, as a man who needed to learn that roads belong to everyone, not just those with expensive carriages. I fell in love with you in that moment, Miss Wentworth, and I have been falling deeper ever since." "My lord, you cannot speak of love to a tenant farmer's daughter," Patience whispered, her world tilting dangerously. "I removed the eviction clauses for all my tenants because it was just," he continued, as if she had not spoken. "But also because I could not approach you while wielding power over your family's survival. I had to remove all leverage first, all implied threat. I needed you to be free to choose your own path, even if that path led away from me. Can you understand that?" "Yes," Patience said, because she did. Because it was exactly the kind of gesture a man who had funded hospitals for plantation workers would make. The kind of gesture that valued justice above personal advantage. "But, my lord—" "Miles," he interrupted. "When we are alone, please call me Miles." "Miles," she said, the name strange and intimate on her tongue. "I am engaged to Owen Fletcher. The banns have been read. The wedding is 3 weeks away. I cannot simply break an engagement because an earl, because you, confess feelings I cannot, I should not." "What you feel does not matter," he asked quietly. "What I feel is complicated," Patience admitted, "and even if I returned your regard, which I do not admit, the difference in our stations makes any connection impossible. You will marry someone appropriate to your rank, a lady of quality and breeding. I am a tenant farmer's daughter. Society would never accept such a misalliance." "Society," Miles said, his voice hardening slightly, "confined my father to a loveless marriage with a woman of appropriate breeding who made every day of his life miserable until she died when I was 8 years old. Society told me I should care more for my bloodline than my happiness, my duty than my heart. I spent 12 years escaping that society by going to India. I will not let it dictate whom I love now." They had reached the lane leading to the Wentworth cottage. Miles reined in his horse but made no move to help Patience dismount. Instead, he turned in the saddle to face her, and the intensity in his grey eyes made her breath catch. "I am not asking you to break your engagement today," he said. "I am asking you to examine your heart honestly before you marry. Do you love Owen Fletcher? Does he make you laugh, make you think, make you want to be the best version of yourself? Or is he simply safe, convenient, the solution to a problem that no longer exists? It is not that simple, Patience said, but her voice was shaking. It is exactly that simple, Miles countered. Life is short, Patience. I learned that in India, watching men die from diseases they did not have to die from, seeing women trapped in situations they could not escape. We get one chance at happiness, one chance to choose love over fear, passion over duty. You deserve that chance, so does Owen Fletcher. He deserves a wife who chose him because her heart demanded it, not because circumstances made him the most logical option. And if I choose him, Patience asked, needing to hear the answer. Then I will wish you joy and never speak of this again, Miles said simply. But please, Patience, choose. Do not simply drift into a future because it requires less courage than choosing a different one. He helped her dismount then, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. Then he was gone, cantering back down the lane. Patience stood outside her cottage with her heart in chaos, and 3 weeks until her wedding. That night, she lay in her narrow bed, listening to Timothy's steady breathing from across the room, and forced herself to examine her heart with brutal honesty. Did she love Owen Fletcher? She liked him, respected him, appreciated his steady kindness. But did her heart race when she saw him? Did she find herself thinking of him at odd moments? Did the thought of spending 50 years waking beside him fill her with joy or resignation? And Miles Ashcroft? The Earl who had learned pulmonary medicine to help workers, who removed eviction clauses because it was just, who looked at her as if she were the only woman in England. Her heart said yes, but her mind warned of the impossibility of such a match, the scandal it would cause, the gap between their stations. By morning she had made her decision. It terrified her, but Timothy was right. Reality had changed. It was time she changed with it. The sense of relentless momentum carried Patience through the next 3 weeks of wedding preparations. She attended fittings for her wedding dress, discussed the breakfast menu with Owen's mother, received gifts from well-wishers. What she saw instead was that Owen was in love with an idea. The idea of a dutiful wife, a good mother for his future children, a capable partner in farm management. He was not in love with Patience Wentworth, the woman who threw mud at Earl's and insisted on gathering herbs herself. He was in love with the role she would fill in his life, and she realized with sad clarity that such a marriage would slowly kill them both. Owen would have a wife who could never give him her full heart, and Patience would become a smaller, quieter version of herself, cutting away the parts that did not fit into the dutiful wife mold until nothing essential remained. Miles had been right. Owen Fletcher deserved better. So did she. The morning of September 28th. Dawned clear and cool, autumn beginning to tinge the edges of summer. Patience woke to the sound of church bells, celebrating what should have been the happiest day of her life. Her wedding dress, months in the making, shimmered like spun moonlight on the wardrobe hook. Her hair was arranged with small white roses from the garden. She looked, she thought, examining herself in the small mirror, like a woman going to her execution rather than her marriage. Downstairs her father and Timothy waited, both in their best clothes. Robert looked proud, but also, Patience realized, slightly worried. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly as they prepared to leave for St. Mary's. "The lease is secure now. If you have doubts, daughter, speak them now. Better a broken engagement than a broken marriage." "I know, father," Patience said. "I have something I must say to Owen. At the church before the ceremony, will you trust me?" Robert studied her face, then nodded slowly. "You are more like your mother every day. Whatever you decide, I will support you." The church was already full when they arrived. Seemingly the entire village of Ashford crowded into the ancient building. Autumn flowers decorated the altar, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the congregation in shades of ruby and sapphire. Owen stood at the front with his father, looking nervous and proud, and at the very back of the church, standing apart from everyone else, was Miles Ashcroft. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and Patience saw in his face everything he had promised: support for whatever choice she made, pain if that choice was not him, and love, deep and steady. and real. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, moving slowly, giving herself time to be absolutely certain. Owen smiled at her, kind and reliable, everything a husband should be, everything except the one thing that mattered most. When she reached the front, when her father stepped back and left her standing beside Owen, Patience turned to face the man she was supposed to marry. "Owen," she said quietly, aware that the church had gone completely silent. "I cannot do this." Owen's face went pale. "Patience. You deserve a woman who chooses you because her heart demanded it," Patience said, using Miles's words because they were true. "A woman who loves you, truly loves you, not just respects and likes you." "I am not that woman, Owen. I tried to be. I wanted to be. But I would be lying to you, to myself, and to God if I spoke vows I cannot wholeheartedly mean." She turned to face the shocked congregation, saw her father's face creased with concern, Timothy's bright with understanding, Harold Fletcher's dark with anger. "The Earl of Rutland removed the eviction clause from my father's lease," she said clearly. "He gave our family the security I thought only marriage could provide. That changed everything. I agreed to marry Owen because I was afraid. Fear makes poor choices. I will not build my life on a foundation dressed as duty." She removed the simple ring Owen had given her weeks before when they announced their engagement, placed it gently in his hand. "You deserve better than a wife who can never love you as you deserve." "I am so sorry, Owen. You have done nothing wrong. This is entirely my failure, my fear, my inability to be what you need." For a long moment, Owen stood frozen, the ring in his palm, his face a map of emotions Patience could not read. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was a sad smile, but genuine. "I think," he said quietly, "I have known for weeks that your heart was elsewhere. I simply did not want to admit it. Perhaps I too was building on fear, on the comfort of the expected rather than the risk of the unknown." He raised his voice so the whole church could hear. "I release Miss Wentworth from her promise to me. Better a broken engagement than a broken marriage. I wish her well." The church erupted. Some people looked scandalized, others whispered behind their hands. Harold Fletcher stood up, his face red with anger, and stalked from the building. But Patience barely noticed any of it. She was walking down the aisle, past the shocked faces, toward the back of the church where Miles Ashcroft stood. When she reached him, he said nothing, simply offered his hand. She took it, and together they walked out into the autumn sunlight, leaving the chaos behind. They walked in silence to the small churchyard behind St. Mary's, where ancient tombstones leaned at drunken angles and wildflowers grew between the graves. Only when they were entirely alone did Miles turn to face her. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now," Patience said, her heart racing but her voice steady, "you tell me honestly if what you said 3 weeks ago was true. If you truly believe we can overcome the difference in our stations, the scandal this will cause, the opposition we will face." "I believe," Miles said, taking both her hands in his, "that love is rarer and more precious than any title. I believe that a woman who throws mud at an earl because her brother needs medicine is worth more than 100 ladies of quality who would never risk getting their hands dirty. I believe that you challenge me, humble me, make me want to be a better man, a better landlord, a better person. And yes, Patience Wentworth, I believe we can overcome anything if we face it together." "Then," Patience said, feeling tears slide down her cheeks, "I should probably tell you that I have loved you since the moment you asked if Timothy's tonic had helped, since the moment you sent Dr. Bellamy, since the moment you removed those clauses, not for me, but because it was just. I tried so hard not to love you, Miles. I failed completely." He kissed her then, there among the wildflowers and tombstones, a kiss that tasted of tears and hope and impossible possibilities becoming real. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Miles said, "We should probably discuss practical matters, like how to handle the scandal you just created." "The scandal we just created," Patience corrected. "You were at the church too, obviously waiting for me." "Obviously," he agreed, smiling, "though I would have supported whatever choice you made. Even if I had married Owen. Even then, though I confess I'm profoundly grateful you did not." They sat on a weathered stone bench, still holding hands, and began to plan. It would not be easy. The ton would be scandalized by such a misalliance. There would be those who called Patience a fortune hunter, Miles a fool. But they would marry respectably after a proper courtship. They would face society together. 6 months, Miles said firmly, long enough for the scandal to die down somewhat, long enough for everyone to see that this is not some mad impulse, but a genuine attachment. And long enough, he added with a smile, for me to prove that I can court a woman properly, with chaperones and afternoon calls, and all the proper conventions I have been ignoring. 6 months, Patience agreed, though I warn you, my family does not have a proper drawing room for receiving callers. You may have to court me in the dairy. Then I shall become an expert in cheese-making, Miles said solemnly. I already know something of pulmonary medicine and Indian plantation management. Why not add dairy farming to my accomplishments? Over the following months, Miles Ashcroft courted Patience Wentworth with a determination that became the talk of Derbyshire. He called at the cottage 3 times a week, always properly, never staying more than 20 minutes as convention demanded. He took Patience for chaperoned walks, Timothy always trailing behind them. He wrote her letters discussing estate management, philosophy, his years in India, everything and nothing. Slowly, grudgingly, society began to accept that the Earl of Rutland had made his choice and would not be swayed. Some of the older aristocrats in the area sniffed and refused to acknowledge Patience when they passed, but others, perhaps remembering their own youthful choices, were kinder, and the tenants and villagers of Ashford embraced the match with enthusiasm, seeing in it proof that their unusual Earl valued character over pedigree. Owen Fletcher, to his credit, handled the broken engagement with remarkable grace. Within 2 months, he was courting the daughter of a prosperous merchant in Bakewell, a lively girl whose smiles were solely for him. When Patience encountered them at the Christmas market, Owen stopped to speak with genuine warmth. "I wish you happy," he said simply. "Both of you. I think perhaps we all needed that scandal to find our true paths." In March of 1815, in the same lane where Patience had once thrown mud at an earl, Miles Ashcroft made a formal proposal. He had chosen the spot deliberately, he told her, because it was where their story had begun. The lane was now repaired, its ruts filled, its drainage improved, primroses blooming along the banks. "I have safeguarded Hardy something for 3 months, Miles said, producing from his pocket a square of silk. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal dried mud, preserved between sheets of glass. "From my coat that morning. I kept it as a reminder that power means nothing if it is not tempered with humility, that convenience is not the same as necessity, and that sometimes the best lessons come from the most unexpected teachers." "You kept the mud I threw at you?" Patience asked, torn between laughter and tears. "A reminder," Miles said, "that I must always listen, that roads belong to everyone, that I must never again stand in someone's way simply because I have the power to do so." He set the framed mud aside and took both her hands. "Patience Dorothy Wentworth, will you marry me? Not because you are afraid, not because it is convenient, but because you choose me, choose us, choose the life we will build together?" "Yes," Patience said without hesitation. "Yes, Miles, I will marry you." They wed in May of 1815 in a ceremony that was both grand and intimate. The church was full, with tenants and aristocrats mixing in the pews, a sight unprecedented in Ashford. Robert Wentworth walked his daughter down the aisle, with tears streaming down his weathered face. Timothy served as a groomsman, healthy and strong, his lungs finally clear thanks to Dr. Bellamy's continued care, and the medicine Miles had funded. The wedding breakfast was held at Rutland Hall, the first time most of the village had been inside the great house. Miles had insisted on inviting everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest tenant. Tables were set up in the gardens, food enough to feed 300. Wine flowing freely. As the afternoon turned to evening, Miles and Patience slipped away from the celebration to walk in the gardens. They found themselves at the edge of the property, looking out over the fields that sloped gently toward the winding river. The land, that had been the source of so much fear and was now the foundation of so much joy. "Do you think it will be difficult?" Patience asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Being a countess?" "I think," Miles said, wrapping his arm around her waist, "that you have spent your entire life managing difficult things. A sick brother, a failing farm, an arrogant Earl who needed to be taught a lesson with mud. Managing a household and an estate will be simple by comparison." "I want to help," Patience said seriously. "With the tenants, I mean. I know them, Miles. I know their families, their struggles, what they need. If I could work with Mr. Hartwell on estate management." "I was hoping you would say that," Miles said, smiling. "I have already discussed it with Hartwell. He is delighted at the prospect of having someone who actually understands tenant farming involved in decision-making. You will revolutionize estate management in Derbyshire, Lady Rutland." "Lady Rutland," Patience repeated, testing the unfamiliar title. "That will take some getting used to." "You have months to practice," Miles said. "Years, decades if I am fortunate." 3 more years later, on a bright September morning, Patience stood in the great entry hall of Rutland Hall and supervised the hanging of a new plaque beside the portraits of previous earls and countesses. Mounted in a place of honor was the framed mud from that long-ago morning with an inscription beneath it. Mud thrown in anger, preserved in love, a reminder that power must always listen and that roads belong to everyone. Their 2 children, Miles Jr. and Dorothy, played nearby, their nurse watching them with patient care. At 3, send us 1. They were already showing signs of their parents' characters. Miles Jr. was thoughtful and intense, already fascinated by his father's books. Dorothy was bold and fearless, likely to throw mud herself one day. Timothy, now Maxon 19, and apprenticed to a respected architect in Derby, had come home for a visit. He stood beside Patience, looking at the plaque, and laughed. "Who would have thought," he said, "that my sister throwing mud at an earl would lead to all this?" "All of what?" Patience asked, though she knew. "Happiness," Timothy said simply. "For you, for father, for the tenants, even for Owen Fletcher, who is engaged to that merchant's daughter now." That moment of rebellion changed everything. Outside, the sound of a carriage approaching made them both turn. Through the window, Patience saw a familiar sight. A fine carriage blocking the narrow lane that led to the hall. A farmer with a cart of produce was trying to get past, clearly frustrated. "Should we help?" Timothy asked. "We should," Patience said, already moving toward the door. But before they could reach it, Miles appeared from his study, saw the situation, and was already heading outside. Patience and Timothy followed, arriving just in time to hear Miles say to the carriage driver, "Move aside and let the farmer pass. His produce is needed at the kitchen today, and he has been traveling since dawn. Your convenience is not more important than his need." The carriage moved. The farmer passed with grateful thanks, and Miles turned to find Patience smiling at him with such love that it still, after 3 years, took his breath away. "What?" he asked, though he was smiling too. "Nothing," Patience said. "Just remembering a certain arrogant Earl who once needed to be taught that roads belong to everyone." "That Earl," Miles said, pulling her close despite the watching servants and children, "is very grateful for the lesson." "I threw it at your second-best coat," Patience corrected. "Did you? How considerate of you." Their children shrieked with delight as Miles swooped down to gather them both up, one in each arm. Dorothy immediately grabbed a handful of mud from the garden beside the lane and held it up triumphantly. "Throw," she announced. "Not at Papa, please," Miles said, laughing. "Once per generation is quite enough." "Should we stop her?" Patience asked, watching her daughter's muddy hand with maternal pride. "Let her learn early," Miles said, echoing the words Patience would remember later. "That power should be questioned, that convenience is not the same as necessity, and that sometimes the right thing to do is messy." They stood there together, a family built on a foundation of mud and courage, watching as their daughter carefully placed her handful of mud back on the ground instead of throwing it. Then Dorothy looked up at her parents and said her newest word. "Listen." "Yes, my darling," Patience said, kneeling beside her daughter. Always listen. To your heart, to what is right, to what matters. Even if the whole world tells you to wait, to be patient, to accept what you are given. Listen to your own voice first. Miles reached down to help Patience stand, their hands linking in a gesture so familiar now it felt like breathing. Shall we go inside? He asked. I believe Cook has prepared something special for Timothy's visit. In a moment, Patience said. She looked around at the fields, sloping gently toward the winding river. At the Bex-repaired lane and prosperous farms, at the tenants' working land they no longer feared to lose, at her healthy brother, her beautiful children, her beloved husband. What are you thinking? Miles asked softly. That in 3 years ago, I stood in this exact spot, terrified and desperate, and threw mud at a stranger because my brother needed medicine and I was too angry to care about consequences. And that moment of reckless courage changed absolutely everything. Not just for you, Miles said, for all of us, for 47 tenant families who sleep secure now. For me, who found a woman who saw past the title to the man. For our children, who will grow up knowing that power comes with responsibility, and that class means nothing compared to character. All because of mud, Timothy added, grinning. All because, Patience corrected gently, someone finally stood in the road and refused to move. Someone said that her need mattered as much as an Earl's convenience. That roads belong to everyone, not just those with expensive carriages. She looked at Miles, at the man she had covered with mud and later covered with love, and saw her whole future in his storm-grey eyes. A future of laughter and partnership, of challenging each other and growing together, of teaching their children that courage matters more than convention and love matters more than title. Come, she said, taking his hand and gathering her children close. Let us go inside, but Miles. Yes, my love? Keep that mud on the wall, as a reminder. Always, he promised. As a reminder that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected moments, and that I should never ever block a lane when a determined woman needs to pass. They walked back to Rutland Hall together, a family built on the unlikely foundation of thrown mud, secured by removed clauses and cemented by a love that had overcome every obstacle society could place in its path. Behind them, the lane stretched empty and open, sunlight glinting off puddles, primroses blooming on the banks, a road that belonged to everyone. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of courage, love, and standing up for what matters touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of resilience, hope, and unforgettable romance.